Hello, welcome to the Dallas Literary Festival. This is our panel, The Incarceration of African American Women from Harriet Tubman to Sandra Bland. I'm going to be introducing Kenton Rambsy, who's an assistant professor of African American literature at the University of Texas at Arlington. And he is also the author of the Jay-Z mixtape and Lost in the City, an exploration of Edward P. Jones's short fiction. Just in terms of questions, we'll have a little Q&A section at the end, and you can send those questions to me in the chat, and I will relay them to our panelists. But Kenton, if you'd like to go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today to talk about, and our panel title is, and I want to make sure I pronounce this correctly, excuse me. I want to make sure I get this actual panel title correct because it's so important. The Incarceration of African American Women from Harriet Tubman to Sandra Bland. Oftentimes we talk about stories involving Black women, especially now in the past 5, especially the past 2 years, as being some source of conflict, as being some source of ideas being erased from history. In this session, I really want us to focus on the positive aspects of this in terms of creativity. How do Black women serve as an inspiration or creative muse? So to get us started, I would like to introduce the featured person of the hour, Dr. DaMaris Hill, who holds a close place to my heart because she's also my graduate school office mate. So to get us started, I would like Dr. Hill to begin by opening with 2 brief poems and also tell us where we can find your book.
Okay, thanks so much, Kenton. I want to begin, I'm going to begin with the work, but I cannot begin without saying thank you to my friends who are supporting me in this journey of producing this book, writing this book, and this literary life, which are both Kenton Rambsy and Sandra Smith. And I couldn't imagine doing this panel with anyone but Kenton. He's a brilliant literary scholar, a brilliant person in and of itself. And I think he intimately understands the work on an intellectual level. But also it's really nice to be able to talk to people that you're really close to about something that you spent so much time alone doing. It's a different conversation. And I'm so happy to have this conversation with Kenton and to be here by the invitation of Sandra. So I'm gonna open up. A Bound Woman is a Dangerous Thing can be found hopefully at your local bookstore, at large retail bookstores like Barnes and Nobles. And people seem to have a lot of success picking the book up on Amazon. The book opens referencing my ancestors, those of blood and those of legacy. So I want to open up by reading a poem about the life my grandmother and I share. Even though my grandmother was not a woman that was incarcerated, she was raised in the Jim Crow South. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the irony of our lives is that she was the only one of her brothers and sisters not to go to college because she got married. She wanted to be a librarian. And ironically, if I hear voices, I use them to create literature and I make money off of them. So I don't see our lives too desperate. Shut up in my bones, for Harriet Beecher Sproul Hill. I have the racket of anxiety in my genes. It rivets in ink. Spite this, I leave these marks, this evidence of us undone. In wit's end, it all ferments, and we shape totems of shame from our amusements. The musk of my imagination is as redolent as any untamed woman, and likewise mistaken for mental illness. Perfection is a mask, a perfume in my pulse. I learn to hide what is feared. To be literate is to pen oneself with needles, shape beauty from a funhouse mirror. This is how artists learn a craft of display. Call this confession a lie. Look closer. I stubbed my toe, tightrope walking, the lashes of circus clowns. Only the liberated can see the legacies of bondage stirring beyond the ribbons. I have come to know I am the savory morsel in America's teeth. These words are clawed into the enamel. My face is familiar among the haints. I wear her likeness like a call. See, I had a grandma who could read lightning speeds. Now some Holy Ghost, the best life had for her was this country's secondhand soldier, a loving husband, no room for books and babies at her breast. The sanctified think marriage is a type of reward if you are a second generation out of slavery, color of coffee bean type of woman, and your hair is some black lacquer of unruly licorice that has branches that wave like echoes. Her smile whiter than seashells, her breath the scent of tobacco, as narrow as a Carolina pond with the worries about rage of white folks. She died gifting me her photos, the only story she would write. At birth, her name becomes my velvet lush heirloom, tufted behind my mother's. It is costly to stay free and appear sane. I am she and an extravagant kind, a shimmy spilling from her buttons, the erotic unbridled, a glimmer riding the golden. I am her shrill of laughter clapping in doubt, curiosity, a coy friend, chaos, my alter ego. I mistook a jagged molar for an ivory tower, and I ain't got the good sense God gave me to rock. The second poem that I'll read, as Kenton requested, is to an ancestor of legacy. And this is a poem that I wrote for Lucille Clifton, and it's called In the Garden. In the garden of marble and men, I swivel slowly in. I am some clay-faced Janus, following the drums of your tongue. Did you know these halls are prone to echo? God is dead, yet the walls are greedy for confessions. Your words mirror my truth. Forgive me. My voice is a tapestry of tacks, trying to wear the skin of your hands.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for opening with that, to give the audience members just a taste of what's in your book, and also to kind of jumpstart this conversation tonight. So one of the things at UTA, I'm also an affiliate faculty in Women and Gender Studies, and I really, love to claim this idea of Black feminist theory, Black feminist thought. So I'm always using Patricia Hill Collins' 1990 book, Black Feminist Thought, as a measuring rod of sorts to kind of give a historical reference, but also to measure to see how this idea of feminism has changed. In her 1990 book, she writes, "What is Black feminism? Inherent in their words and deeds is a definition of Black feminism as a process of self-conscious struggle that empowers women and men to actualize a humanist vision of community." In March 2021, how do you see your book fitting into this tradition and extending it, especially as it pertains to Black women?
Well, I hope it fits in this tradition. I too value Patricia Hill Collins, and this is a very thoughtful question. This book unintentionally became a device for me to become even more reflective and even more subconscious about the responsibilities of a Black woman creative intellectual, to make sure that I talk about the complexity of our stories and the complexities of our humanness. And it's not that I don't appreciate the contributions that other scholars and Black men and other intersectional identities have made. I do, but one way that I see that my book is fitting into this type of tradition is that we've been having the conversation for many years about the erasure of the contributions of Black women's work in America. Within a decade, the incarceration rate for Black women increased over 800%. the prison industrial complex subsidized a lot of the production that is happening in corporate venues. Some of those venues who have in the past participated in prison industrial labor include Victoria's Secret. And those of us on the call who have ever shopped at Victoria's Secret know that we pay very high prices for Victoria's Secret garments. And some of these women may have been making 22 cents an hour or $2 an hour to produce these goods. Also, Whole Foods at one time actively participated in prison labor. And IKEA has been noted to participate in prison labor. So when we think about the increases of women into this type of labor system, not acknowledging the surge in incarceration rates for women is another type of violence and erasure about all of the ways that Black women continue to subsidize democracy capitalism masked as democracy. And so hopefully I'm extending that tradition in that way.
All right, thanks. Thanks for that one. So, I wanted to kind of open that one up just to kind of ground us in this idea that Black women in your book, that I have right here, are a focal point. But, because we've kind of traveled a similar road, at least in terms of education, both of us went to HBCUs for undergrad. We went to PWIs for graduate school, and now we're both working at PWI institutions. So I want to really talk about your creative voice and what that means for how you represented Black women. I'm just looking at the table of contents and how this is laid out. You have a series of people's names, starting with Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lucille Clifton, going down to Ella Jackson, Ida Howard, and you have them broken up into bound, feathered, and so on. So I have a question for you. How did you organize? It comes about organization, but it also talks a little bit about influence. At an HBCU, you've had Black women influences, and also at a PWI, you've had Black women influences as teachers and mentors. How did they shape your voice, your creative outlook, your language, your word choice, your tone, your rhythm, your content? Can you talk a little bit about how Black women scholars have really influenced the structure and voice of your work now?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And it's kind of a complex migrational kind of journey that, is going to center on these train tracks that are like what's happening in creative writing, and then the choices that I made because they were happening at parallel times. So first I want to say that 85% of the people that attend HBCUs are Black women. And one of the first mentors that I had at a historically Black college and university by the name of Morgan State University was Monifa Love Asante. And when I met Monifa Love Asante, she was coming from Florida. And when I asked her about her choice to be at an HBCU, she said she's committed to Black women. And so there wasn't another space that she wanted to be in. She wanted to work for an HBCU. Also, when I entered Morgan State University, there was a conversation happening at a new emergent conference called the Furious Flower of Poetry Conference at James Madison University that was started by Joanne Gavin, who also attended Morgan State University. And we shared a multiplicity of professors before I ever met her, right? And there was this conversation happening at Furious Flower about the development of the next generation of creative writers and how we as a community of writers and poets had not significantly invested in cultivating a creative writing tradition at HBCUs. And the program that I entered at Morgan was a direct result of those kinds of conversations. So I appreciate that. And then the network, being being in Baltimore, I was very fortunate to have very strong Black women mentors, at least 4 in my life at once, and a very committed Jewish woman who understood our differences, but also understood the value of mentorship and was committed. That HBCU experience and those women educated me in love. And when I entered the PWI experience at Kansas, which was an extension of that network, Mary Emma Graham, Monifa Lovasanti, Joanne Gavin, all of these people had a community. And I was introduced to the graduate program at Kansas through that community and encouraged to be there at Kansas because I wanted to study Black women's writing. And my mentors thought it was best to study Black women's writing under a Black woman literary scholar, which wasn't available at a lot of PWIs at the time, particularly those that have PhDs in creative writing. And so Kansas became that choice. These women continue to mentor and shape my life and my creative choices. As far as like the word choice, voice, and rhythm, it comes from them, but it also comes from reading literature that's not exclusively contemporary. Like I was having this conversation yesterday and laughing so hard in my gut. The shadiest Black women writers that'll give you the most pleasure when you're reading are Zora Neale Hurston and that Maya Angelou. Oh, they so shady, they will make you buckle over in the bed using Black women vernacular and sensibilities. And I want to bring that into the work. And I do not want to say it's a result of, but I think as Black literature continues to become more mainstream, there are a multiplicity of voices that emerge. And I think the publishing industry, their ear may not be as attuned to the sophistication and lingual dexterity that some Black women are engaged in. So we don't see this type of vernacular dexterity or Black women's linguistic currency in a lot of contemporary literature.
Okay, I like this idea. You started talking about infrastructure. You know, you're stepping into something that was a result of Black women having conversations about for a literal creative writing program, and it was able to, you know, kind of shepherd you through this process. In addition to that, you just did something I love, and you name dropped 2 people, Maya Angelou and Zora Neale Hurston, to kind of give us an example of what do you mean by shade? What do you mean by funny? What type of language, you know, inspires you? So that's why I really want to keep us going towards this creative process, Harriet Tubman to Sandra Bland. So with that being said, how did you select the women for your book? And more than just how did you select the women, how does your work represent these Black women in historical context? And after you ask that question, answer that question, can you give us a little specificity by 1 or 2 examples of people that you chose in your book, how you chose them and how you represent them?
Okay. One, I want to say that I chose a lot more women than are in the book. And I want to admit that the women that didn't make the book, I felt that because these are poems, but I also call them like love letters. I felt that the love letter wasn't strong enough, so I didn't want to publish it. Because it was important to me that each of the women in the book, that I was able to honor or create a double helix and honor their legacy, but also honor their complexity as human beings. And so if I could not do both of those things well on the page, I didn't want to include the poem. that's how I kind of selected who was in the book. There were lots of pages and poems that didn't make the book. There are so many other people that I think that could have been included and that were important. So I will try to read an example. So I'm going to read a really hard poem, and I won't read the whole thing, but an example of how I tried to honor their life's work and the complexity of who they are, I think is best articulated in Ida B. Wells. It is a poem that's written in linguistic vernacular, but also mathematically reasoned. And we always learn about Ida B. Wells as this teacher and this journalist. But what people don't talk about, which is a part of her brilliance, is that in the 1880s and 1890s, she was on the forefront of a new science called demography and statistical science. And people leave that out of her complexity and leave that, erase that part of her brilliance, right? Why can't she be mathematically intellectual and journalistically talented and also an educator? So yeah, this is the poem for Ida B. Wells Barnett. And I'm gonna try to hold a piece of it up in the camera so people can see there's a lot of math in there. The speed of light is almost equivalent to love come in a hurry. There are thieves in the temple circa 1892 equals 241 lynched, equals they are torn from their wives' arms, times the rope, plus the tree. And all of this is set ablaze for white supremacy and the mob violence. 26 states proportionally united equal Alabama with at least 22 lynchings. Arkansas, where 25 or more people hang from trees. In California, they say there are 3, probably more. And then in Florida, they tell us that 11 people have been lynched. I dare to say more. And in Georgia, they boast of 17 people lynched that year. In Idaho, 8 people are set ablaze. In Illinois, they tell us about 1. In Kansas, they say 3. In Kentucky, a space that I currently occupy, there are at least 9 people lynched. And in Louisiana, they boast of 29 people sacrificed to white supremacy. In Maryland, they tell us of at least 1. In Mississippi, they say 16, probably more. In Missouri, they tell us about 6. I dare to say they are lying. In Montana, they say at least 4 people hanged. In New York, they report 1 person lynched. Definitely more. In North Carolina, they say at least 5 people have been lynched. In Ohio, they say there are 3 or more people lynched. In South Carolina, they tell us about 5, possibly more. In Tennessee, home of the Ku Klux Klan, there are 28 people, probably more, lynched in the year 1892. In Texas, they tell us of 15, probably more. In Virginia, they say 7. In West Virginia, 5 people swing from trees. In Wyoming, there are 9. In the Arizona Territory, not yet a state, there are 3 in Oklahoma. And this is the Delta Durga, the multiplied increase and the surge of lynching. The speed of light is almost equivalent as love come in a hurry. There are thieves in the temples, 160 Negro plus 80 others, 5 of them women, Two of the states are over the Mason-Dixon, and one of them claims to be free. The square root of Black economic progress is proportional to pure gold American racism and the demon possession of Francis Wood's good Christian. So I'm going to stop there, Kenton, because if I continue to read the rest of the poem, I won't be able to finish this. It's
Okay.
one of the poems that kind of takes me under, sorry.
No, thanks for sharing that with us. And I also want to point out, thank you for sharing us another contribution which Ida B. Wells is oftentimes overlooked for. And that is because she was keeping amazing stats that detailed the lynching of Black people across the United States at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century. But one thing that I think is most important, I'm also working as a summer director of the Howard University Mellon Summer Institute, and one of my fellows is working on a project, and she's basically replicating all of Ida B. Wells' stats. And one stat that I found particularly interesting was that the amount of Black women that were executed or hung or lynched were not lynched for committing crimes, but simply for associating with known criminal Black men. So with that being said, with you introducing us to another aspect of Ida B. Wells, I want to ask you a question that is a cardinal sin to ask to a creative writer. But what is the practicality of your book? And let me tell you why I asked this question. And let me tell you, expound a little bit more on this. And the wake of George Floyd, and when George Floyd was murdered, we saw a rise in anti-racist, a demand for anti-racist books. Many of those books were histories, social commentary. Not often did we see creative books, creative works, fiction, poetry seem to be requested like this. So I want to get the story all the way straight as an English professor, because this is what I do, explain why literature is needed, explain what the practical uses of it are. Describe the function of your book in classrooms, high schools, middle schools, colleges. What do readers gain from this? How can teachers use this as an introduction or a gateway to different texts or histories about Black women? Yeah, so again, that cardinal sin, that very insulting question. What is the practicality of this book and how can we use this?
Okay, the practical, well, I want to start by saying this, that most people do find that a cardinal sin. I don't find it a sin because I surrendered to the book, and whatever the work is supposed to do, that's just what the work is doing. That's just it. Once you publish it and put it in the world, it doesn't belong to you anymore. As you know, Ken, I've been working on this book since 2003, definitely was working on it again in 2008, 2012. I kept rewriting this book, trying to get it right. I thought I was writing the book for my nieces and for my granddaughter, who is not yet conceived, but already loved. She needed it, right? I was writing it for them. And I didn't expect to be on a mainstream publisher, such as Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury had never published poetry before. I want to thank J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter books for allowing them to take a risk on me. But I want to also take a minute to talk about solidarity. And I know right now in our current landscape, we are seeing a lot of non-Black women abandon Black women to the wayside. My agent is like an 80-something-year-old Jewish woman, and my editor is a 70-year-old Jewish woman. And she said after the marketing meeting, when people talked about really, this team of all white women that were going to market the book, talked about how much they loved the book. After that meeting, we walked out into the hall and she whispered, she said, listen, I didn't know they were going to like the book, but I was with you because I knew the book was important. So I was going to stand with you, but it's great that they like the book. And so I want to talk about that is an act of love and social justice in itself, to be a person in a position of power and to know that a choice you made may not be a welcome choice by your team, but decide that that you believe in a project, that it's an act of love, and it explains the complexity that needs to be spoken. So you're going to risk your social capital or your professional capital to publish it. With that said, even though I came out on Bloomsbury, we did not expect for people to gravitate to this book. We're surprised every time something happens. We're just still surprised, because I thought I was writing a book for Black women, and then everybody was kind of reading it without that intersectional lens. And I welcomed that. And I hope that, that everybody can have a relationship with the women in the book. But I don't know. I know that the book is being taught in women's studies classes, American studies classes, English literature classes, social justice classes, poetry classes. I didn't have that intention, but I'm hoping that with the book being in these spaces, that we're starting to recognize historical figures not underneath one narrative, but in their complexity of their humanness. And knowing that Black women change agents and historical figures don't operate in isolation. That's what we always learn in school. There's just one Black woman doing one great thing. And that's not true. Black women continue to work in networks and rely on each other, despite whatever their ideological differences are in the mainstream dialogue. Like, I wish we all got a chance to write our own histories for ourselves, but unfortunately, often those that have more cultural capital and power than us are left to summarize our stories, and inevitably a piece of our humanness is erased.
Okay, I love this. I love this. So I got to push a little bit more to ask this other question, because you know this about me. I don't believe in sheltering people from things, but I do believe timing is everything. So what would you say to a teacher teaching this at the middle school level, at the high school level, at the college level, or for a general reader walking around a bookstore and finds this book? In two sentences max, what would you say to them? Each of those different groups.
May these women,
of course, those are different responses. You can pick whichever one you want to. You talk to middle school, high school, general readers, what have you.
First of all, you are making me sweat, Kenton, because these are like the hardest interview questions I've ever encountered all together. But the first thing I always say when someone encounters the book and they may reach out to me is I say, may the women in this book continue to bless and guide us. Because that's really what I want. I was talking to some people the other day, and they wanted to have a conversation about, being woke, decolonizing the mind, and social justice. And I talked to them about social justice is just an affirmed action that says I've decided to love human beings. Like, it's not an ethical choice. You've decided to love human beings, and you are being active in that choice. And I don't think people should apologize for that. So I hope that these women teach us how to love one another as human beings, and with a fearlessness, and resist types of oppression. Now, what would I say to someone reading the book? Have fun and have a conversation.
I love that part. Have fun and have a conversation. Again, this idea of timing, this idea of conversations, this idea of structured conversation, I think is so important, especially as when we're coming to creative works. Why did people make the decisions they made when writing something, when composing something, when putting it together? I think that is so fascinating and something that's oftentimes overlooked. But Okay, we're still talking about some heavy names, Harriet Tubman, Sandra Bland. Was
Mhm.
there any pressure channeling such familiar figures? And if so, if there were pressures, can you describe those pressures for us? It's kind of like almost, Coming to America, the remake. You know what I mean? When it's something that's so big, what does it mean when you're channeling such known figures? Did you have any pressures with that?
I did have pressure, but it wasn't the type of pressure that I think you're talking about, like the expectation to get the history right. It wasn't that. It was the expectation of the person I was writing about. Like, I mean, I'm just going to talk about it because I don't really know how else to talk about it. But Lucille Clifton talks about sometimes when you're writing, you're channeling. And the more that this book began to develop, the more it became a responsibility and a pact between these women and I. So there were, again, some poems that weren't finished to the complexity that they should have been. There were some women in here that I refuse to call murderers, as history has called them murderers. There are pictures in here of women that I had to pay cash money for because I refused to take any pictures of these women in handcuffs or in chains or behind bars. I refused to duplicate that in this book. I wanted these women's stories to exceed the oppressions and binds. I wanted us to recognize these women as the gifts and precious people that they were. So the expectations weren't really to history because I'm gonna get in so much trouble. I didn't become a historian because history, that linear story often fails people, particularly Black women. And so I just couldn't get down with it. And it's one of the reasons why I continue to be a writer. I like history. I don't like historical methods. Historical methods are another way to bind and to control people. And I'm not invested in that. So I didn't have an expectation for history. I had an expectation to the people I thought I was talking to with the book in terms of using a Black woman's vernacular to tell histories. And if you read the histories in this book, I try to, as much as I can reference, talk about who the person's friends were, because that's how Black women talk about one another. Oh, she hang with her, or she rolled with her, right? And so I wanted to make it a point to talk about those relationships and give them just as much weight as their historical contributions.
Okay, cool. So first off, I want to say this to the audience members. Please feel free to start asking questions in the chat. I have one more question that I want to ask for DaMaris, Dr. Hill, pardon me. I want to ask one more question. We have about 10 minutes left. But this question, I want to kind of end on thinking about creativity again, where we began, particularly thinking about creativity, Black women, and incarceration. All right. This is what I want to say. So as you know, my older brother has a book thinking about bad Black men as creative touchstones. You know what I'm saying? This always bad figure. Think about even American Gangster Frank Lucas, who's portrayed by Denzel Washington, a bad man. What does it mean for us to think about bad Black women as a creative figure? And when I say bad, I like this. I'm playing with this word. You know what I mean? When I say bad, because you just said it, you refused to show them in handcuffs. You didn't want to see them being portrayed in a certain way. So what does it mean to be a bad Black woman for your creative sensibilities?
I'm going to try to illustrate it with two women that are in the book. Harriet Tubman and Assata Shakur, in writing this book and in their lives, which I think are parallel lives. Like they lived 200 years apart, but they were both committed to not their individual liberation, but the liberation of all people. And in doing so, they were rewarded. Like Harriet Tubman who had, equivalent to $1 million price on her head, dead or alive, got to die in the nursing home that she built, a free woman, and not too poor. She ain't one for nothing. You know what I'm saying? And I hope right now that Assata Shakur is sitting on a beach somewhere, drinking her best drink, hearing the music of her life, and still dancing and moving them hips and all type of joy, wherever she is. Because every speak of liberation out her mouth was not an individual request, but a call for liberation of all people, because I believe she loved people. And so, those two women taught me that it's all or nothing. When you try to piecemeal this liberation, when you try to piecemeal freedom, I don't know if it works out.
So we have a question. Thanks for that. I'm always like, why are bad women so disturbing? Particularly, why are bad Black women? You know what I'm saying? So disturbing. But I also find it to be a process or a space for so much creativity to think about why do some people bother certain people so much? So here's a question I have again. Does this book discuss the incarceration of women? And if you could answer that one concisely, we have one more question too for one of our KU folks.
I discuss statistics and some information around incarceration. It's not as detailed, let's say, as a sociological book or a type of cultural history that's rooted in anthropology. But several chapters in the book talk about women that have been incarcerated. One poem that I wanted to read, but I'm just going to call her name, is there's a poem in this book to Sandra Bland, because she is from Texas, who was kind of a guide for me in the beginning when I was writing this book, and a guide for me, she was in and out. Janiah McClellan, which is a young girl, a young teenager that died here in Kentucky. She was already separated from her mother through foster care. Her and her mother were having a visit. Her and her mother got into an argument. The mother called the police because she didn't want the argument to escalate and it extend their time apart. And within that night, her daughter was dead because the police put her in a chokehold. The whole second chapter is based on Callie Gross's book, Colored Amazons, that talk about many Black women who migrated to Philadelphia for liberty and a better life, and then found themselves incarcerated in the Eastern State Penitentiary. So there are a number of women who are incarcerated here. And we have to remember that Harriet Tubman was called a criminal. We getting ready to put on money. Well, we got a lot of criminals on money, but I'm sorry.
I really want this next question to get out because, it's our boy, Ben Cartwright. You know what I'm saying? It's such a beautiful question, Ben. Too. What's up, Ben? Thanks for coming. So this is what he says. You spoke beautifully about voice in your writing process and the connection to your grandmother at the beginning of this wonderful conversation. Could you say more about voice and characters in your writing? I teach creative writing and often hear a voice when I'm creating a character, but my students share with me that they come to or create characters differently. Not all of them hear a voice.
Mm-hmm. I'm unsure what to do with that. But I think hearing the voice is so important that if I don't hear the voice, I ask permission to write the story. Sometimes the permission is given and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's given with stipulations, But voice is hard to capture. Sometimes voice is like a literal kind of linguistic calling, or in the Ida B. Wells poem, literally for 4 days, I couldn't write anything about this poem. And it was like I was running into a wall. And I started to rely on in a previous life, before I was too courageous to admit that I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a cognitive scientist or a learning scientist. And so I learned a little bit about how to make the brain do tricks And one of the things that I do when I'm having a hard time writing or understanding a concept is I meditate on a song. And the song that I meditated on for 4 days and then continued to meditate on as I was writing and revising the Ida B. Wells poem is Prince's Thieves in the Temple, because we know that sexual assault was the opposite side of lynching. It was also what was happening in droves at the same time. And I also chose Prince because Prince is eclectic. He's not very classical in his composition, but he's also precise. And in doing that, I was able to get my brain to kind of create and make a type of poetry and lyrical musicality out of things that seem so desperately apart as numbers and words.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, we have like 3 more minutes, and I want to end on just one thing. But first, before we end, first I have to give so much thanks to the SMU community for having us. Also, thank you so much to Sandra Smith, such a great friend of mine who's done so much amazing work in the Dallas area with just organizing and keeping this idea of a contemporary Black art scene and art in general alive and booming. So I want to remind the audience member, a bound woman is a dangerous thing, okay? You all, a bound woman is a dangerous thing. Well-behaved women rarely make history, right? So Dr. Hill, this is one thing I always end with, you mentioned the song thing, because I always think, what song can you relate to your creative work? What other creative work would you recommend that our audience members, in 2 minutes, we have 2 minutes left, what other creative work would you pair, or works would you pair with your text, A Bound Woman is a Dangerous Thing, just to keep us thinking about this conversation of Black women, incarceration, and creativity?
Nina Simone, For Women. I don't talk about this hardly ever, but what I'm doing creatively, of course, is not divorced from a Black woman's creative tradition, but even all the way down to like a girlhood tradition of roll calling names that happens like in the play that Black girls do. This is like a grown-up version of that. Like, what's your name is, what you do. It's a grown-up version of that. It's a part of that tradition where we, as Black girls, may be outside playing and using our bodies to dance, using our bodies to celebrate, using our bodies to sing, and using our bodies to remember one another. So I think it's kind of that too. And I see Nina Simone's For Women in that tradition too.
All right, thank you so much. And again, thanks for having me today. Thanks for engaging in the conversation, D. Hill. And I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine.
All right, thank you, Ken, for interviewing me. Thank you. Love you. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to our 2 panelists for speaking. We have 2 events after this one. At the 6 o'clock hour, Young Writers Contest winners read their works, which is being moderated by Stacey McGalley, and Publishing on the Fringes, Small Presses and Decentralization During COVID. Those are our last ones for today. And then after that, tomorrow we'll have more events all day. But thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate everybody that came. Have a great day. Be safe, be blessed.